Okay, so get this. We're diving into a potential trade war today. And not just any trade war, but one between the U.S. and Canada.
Oh, wow.
We want to understand what could happen if things escalate, especially how Canada might hit back
Yeah.
and what that means for both countries.
It's a high-stakes game for sure.
Yeah.
Right now, President Trump is on the verge of slapping some serious tariffs on Canadian goods.
Oh, wow.
We're talking a 25% hit on exports and a 10% levy on energy.
And we're not talking about some distant future here.
Right.
This is playing out right now.
Absolutely.
You've sent over some really interesting articles about this.
Yeah.
News reports, economic analysis, even some opinion pieces.
Yes, what's striking is the range of reactions.
Yeah.
Some experts are predicting a swift resolution, while others are warning of a protracted trade war
Right.
with global consequences.
And right out of the gate, we've got some strong personalities involved.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Ontario Premier Doug Ford is practically spitting fire, threatening to annihilate Ontario's trade relationship with the U.S.
His rhetoric is definitely attention-grabbing.
Yeah.
But what's really raising eyebrows is his threat to cut off electricity to U.S. states,
Why?
like New York and Michigan.
Wait, but wouldn't cutting off electricity hurt Canada too?
Well,
Is that a realistic move, or is it just political posturing?
it's a bit of both.
Okay.
Those states are heavily reliant on Canadian power, especially during peak demand.
Uh-huh.
Disrupting that flow would definitely cause chaos,
Right.
but it would also hurt Ontario's energy sector.
So it's a double-edged sword?
Yeah,
It seems more like a bargaining chip than a real plan.
I think that's a fair assessment.
But let's talk about the actual impact. How much electricity are we talking about here?
In 2024, the U.S. imported almost 39 terawatt hours of electricity,
Okay.
and Canada supplied 95% of that.
Wow.
That's enough to power every home in Texas for a year.
That's huge.
Cutting that off would be a shock to the system, especially for those states that depend on it the most.
Wow, that puts it into perspective. No wonder people are taking this threat seriously. But Ontario's not just talking about flipping the switch on the power grid, right?
No, they're not.
They've got other ideas brewing.
They're exploring a whole arsenal of retaliatory measures.
Okay.
One option is to slap a surcharge on every megawatt of electricity sold to the U.S.,
Right.
essentially driving up the price.
Right.
Another is to terminate that $100 million deal with Elon Musk's Starlink,
Wow.
which would impact internet connectivity in certain areas.
So they're looking for pressure points that will really get the U.S.'s attention. Is this Ontario going rogue, or does this have the Canadian federal government's backing?
The federal government hasn't endorsed these specific actions,
Okay.
but they have made it clear that they're prepared to retaliate with a dollar-for-dollar strategy if the U.S. goes ahead with the tariffs.
So there's definitely a unified front here, but let's get down to the nitty-gritty. What would these U.S. tariffs actually mean for the Canadian economy?
The impact would be significant, potentially leading to job losses, rising costs, and a hit to key industries like auto manufacturing and steel production.
Okay.
Ontario, being Canada's industrial heartland, is especially vulnerable.
And that's why the Ontario government has already set aside $40 billion in economic relief.
Exactly. They're trying to cushion the blow before it even lands. But it also shows how seriously they're taking this threat and the potential for widespread economic pain.
Okay, so Ontario is ready to rumble and the federal government has their back, but let's shift gears and talk about Canada's energy leverage as a whole. We've touched on electricity.
Yeah.
But the U.S. relies on Canada for a lot more than that, right?
Absolutely. In 2024 alone, the U.S. imported almost $20 billion worth of energy from Canada. That's a staggering number.
Break it down for us. What kind of energy are we talking about here?
We're talking about 1.46 billion barrels of crude oil, 271 billion cubic feet of natural gas, and those 37 terawatt hours of electricity we discussed earlier. That's enough natural gas to heat every home in New York City for over 5 years.
Wow, that's a lot of energy. It sounds like Canada could really bring the U.S. to its knees if it wanted to.
Well, it's not that simple.
Right.
While Canada does have significant energy leverage,
Right.
disrupting that flow would have consequences for both countries.
Right. Like we talked about with electricity, it's a double-edged sword. But let's dive a little deeper into how this energy dependence plays out across different regions of the U.S.
Sure.
Okay. The Midwest and Northeast are particularly reliant on Canadian natural gas for heating.
Yeah.
Especially during those brutal winters, states like New York and Michigan depend heavily on Canadian electricity.
Uh-huh.
especially during peak demand periods.
So disrupting those flows would have a real impact on people's daily lives, not just abstract economic indicators.
We're talking about potential heating shortages, power outages, and price spikes that would hit consumers hard.
So Canada has some serious cards to play in this trade dispute, but they're not just sitting back and waiting to see what the U.S. does, are they?
Yeah.
Not at all. In fact, Canada has been quietly working on a long-term strategy to reduce its reliance on the U.S. market.
And this is where the Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline comes in, right? This thing has been in the news for years.
Yes. The TMX, as it's called, was completed in early 2024 and is already changing the game. It allows Canada to ship significantly more oil to Asian markets, like China, Japan, and South Korea.
So it's like Canada is building a backup plan just in case things go south with the U.S.?
Exactly. They're diversifying their customer base so they're not so dependent on a single market, and it's already having a tangible impact. Alberta's energy exports to China surged to $2 billion in the first 11 months of 2024, a five-fold increase.
Wow, that's a huge jump. So even if the U.S. does impose these tariffs, Canada has options. They're not just going to roll over.
Exactly. Canada is signaling that they're willing to fight back, both in the short term with retaliatory measures and in the long term by reducing their dependence on the U.S. market.
This is shaping up to be a fascinating battle.
Indeed. And it raises a lot of questions. How far is each side willing to go? What are the potential consequences for the global economy? And will diplomacy prevail, or are we headed for a full-blown trade war?
All questions we'll explore in part 2 of this deep dive. So we just explored how Canada's looking to, diversify its energy exports.
Right.
But what about the flip side? What happens to the U.S. if Canada actually follows through on those threats to restrict energy exports?
Yeah, the U.S. could be in for a rough ride, and it's not just about finding enough energy.
Right.
It's about finding the right kind of energy at the right price.
Yeah.
Canada supplies a significant portion of U.S. energy needs.
Right.
And finding alternative sources quickly isn't easy.
So we're not just talking about a few lights flickering.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Remember those regions we talked about?
Yeah.
The Midwest relying on Canadian natural gas for heating the Northeast, depending on Canadian electricity during peak demand.
Right.
Disrupting those flows could mean actual shortages.
Yeah.
Especially if it happens during extreme weather events.
Yeah. And even if the U.S. can, scramble and find enough energy, wouldn't that drive up costs?
Almost certainly the U.S. might have to turn to more expensive sources, like liquefied natural gas shipped from overseas, or rely more heavily on less efficient domestic production.
Yeah.
That means higher prices for businesses and consumers.
And wouldn't all this also have a ripple effect on the U.S.'s climate goals?
Right.
If they're forced to burn more coal or oil to fill the gap, it seems like they'd be taking a step backward.
Yeah, it's a key concern. This trade dispute highlights the complex interplay between, energy security, economic interests, and environmental sustainability.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that decisions made in one area can have far-reaching consequences in others.
Like a chain reaction.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've talked about the economic and political risks, even touched on the environmental angle. But what about the human side of things? What would this mean for people in both countries?
Well, in the U.S., you could see a rise in energy prices, which would hit household budgets, especially for low-income families. Certain industries that rely heavily on Canadian energy could face disruptions.
Yeah.
Or even job losses.
And in a worst-case scenario,
imagine rolling blackouts during a heat wave or harsh winter shortages of essential goods, especially if supply chains are severely disrupted.
Right.
Due to transportation bottlenecks, it wouldn't be pretty.
And on the Canadian side, what's the human impact there?
Job losses in the energy sector would be a major concern, particularly in provinces like Alberta, which heavily rely on oil and gas production.
Right.
The Canadian economy as a whole would likely take a hit, potentially leading to cuts in government services and social programs.
So not exactly a happy ending for anyone.
It's a sobering reminder that trade disputes aren't just abstract political battles. They have real-world consequences for people's lives.
Yeah.
Their livelihoods, their sense of security.
It makes those dollar figures we were talking about feel a lot more real. Okay, so let's zoom out a bit. This whole situation, it's not just a North American problem, right? Could this spill over and affect other countries?
Absolutely. The U.S. and Canada are major players in the global economy.
Right.
And any disruption in their trade relationship could send shockwaves around the world.
Give us some examples. How could this impact other countries?
Imagine a domino effect. If the U.S. is forced to find new sources of energy,
Right.
that increases glowing demand.
Yeah.
pushing up prices everywhere. Countries that rely on Canadian exports might experience shortages or delays, disrupting their own industries. And if two of the world's largest economies are at odds, it can create uncertainty and instability in global markets, making investors nervous.
So this trade dispute has the potential to snowball into something much bigger.
Exactly. It underscores how interconnected the global economy is.
Right.
Actions taken in one part of the world can have far-reaching consequences impacting businesses, consumers, and entire nations.
Yeah.
Far beyond the initial point of conflict.
Okay, so we've painted a pretty bleak picture so far.
Yeah.
But are there any potential silver linings, any possible benefits that could emerge from this crisis?
Well, one potential outcome is that it forces both countries to diversify their economies and become less reliant on each other.
Right.
Canada, as we discussed, is already looking to expand its trade relationships with Asia, and this trade dispute could accelerate that process, leading to new opportunities and partnerships.
And for the U.S., could there be a silver lining for them, too?
It could push them to invest more in domestic energy production, particularly renewable energy sources, as a way to reduce their dependence on foreign imports. They might also look to strengthen trade ties with other countries, spreading their risk and reducing their reliance on any single trading partner.
So this could be a wake-up call for both countries to rethink their economic strategies and become more resilient.
It's a classic case of necessity is the mother of invention.
Right.
While a trade war is undoubtedly a painful and disruptive process, it can sometimes force countries to adapt and innovate, ultimately leading to a more diversified and robust economy in the long run.
Okay, so maybe there's a chance that some good could come out of this mess. But let's be realistic. The immediate future looks pretty tense. We've got these escalating threats, economic uncertainty, and a lot of political posturing.
It's like a high-stakes game of chess.
Yeah.
Each side is trying to anticipate the other's moves, calculate the risks and rewards, and ultimately maneuver themselves into a position of strength.
And the stakes are incredibly high, but let's bring it back down to earth for a moment.
Sure.
Let's consider what this all means for you, the listener. We've thrown a lot of information your way. Tariffs, retaliatory measures, economic forecasts. But what resonates with you? What stands out as particularly significant or surprising? What questions are you left with?
We encourage you to take a moment to reflect on what you've learned so far. Think about the potential scenarios we've discussed, the economic and political implications, the human cost.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, trade disputes like this aren't just about numbers and statistics. They're about people's lives, their livelihoods, their hopes and dreams. And understanding the complexities of these issues is crucial for navigating an increasingly interconnected and uncertain world.
Now let's dive into the political landscape in part 3. We'll explore how this trade dispute is playing out in Canada's political arena and what it could mean for the future of both countries. So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive: potential tariffs, retaliatory measures, economic forecasts, the potential global impact. But now let's shift our focus to the political arena.
Yeah, because behind all the economic data and strategic posturing are real people making decisions that will shape the future of both countries.
Right. We briefly touched on the contrasting approaches of Prime Minister Trudeau and Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre-Trudeau seems to be advocating for a more measured diplomatic response, while Poilievre is taking a much harder line, promising swift and strong retaliation.
This trade dispute has become a political battleground, with each side using it to, score points and advance their own agenda.
So how is this playing out in the Canadian political landscape? Is Trudeau's more cautious approach resonating with voters, or are they looking for a more aggressive stance?
It's a delicate balancing act for Trudeau. He has to appear strong and resolute in defending Canada's interests, but he also needs to avoid escalating the situation and jeopardizing the crucial economic relationship with the U.S.
Right. And Poilievre, how is he using this situation to his advantage?
Poilievre is seizing this opportunity to paint Trudeau as weak and indecisive. He's appealing to voters who are feeling anxious about the economic uncertainty and are looking for a leader who will stand up to the U.S.
So this trade dispute is playing right into the hands of the opposition. They're using it to stoke fears and undermine confidence in the government.
Exactly. It's a classic political tactic. Capitalize on a crisis to advance your own agenda and position yourself as the solution.
And this could have real consequences for the next election if the Canadian economy does suffer as a result of this trade dispute. Trudeau could be held accountable, right?
Absolutely. Voters tend to remember who was at the helm during tough times. If they feel like Trudeau didn't do enough to protect their interests, it could cost him votes.
On the other hand, if he can successfully navigate this crisis and come out looking strong and competent, it could actually strengthen his position.
It's a high-stakes gamble for Trudeau. He's walking a tightrope, trying to balance competing interests and pressures. The outcome of this trade dispute could have a significant impact on his political future and on the direction of Canada as a whole.
So we're left with a lot of unknowns. Will cooler heads prevail? Will both sides find a way to compromise and de-escalate the situation? Or will we see a full-blown trade war erupt with all the economic and political damage that would entail?
Only time will tell. But one thing's for sure, this trade dispute has exposed the underlying tensions and vulnerabilities in the U.S.-Canada relationship.
It's a stark reminder that even the closest of allies can find themselves at odds when economic interests and political pressures collide.
And it highlights the importance of clear communication diplomacy and a willingness to compromise in order to maintain strong and stable relationships, especially in an increasingly interconnected and unpredictable world.
This has been a fascinating deep dive exploring the complexities of this potential U.S.-Canada trade war. We've uncovered the economic stakes, the political maneuvering, the potential human costs, and the wider global implications.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
But by shedding light on these issues, we hope to empower you, the listener, to engage in more informed and nuanced conversations about the challenges and opportunities facing both countries and the world as a whole.
Remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand about these complex global dynamics, the better equipped we are to navigate them and make informed decisions.
And who knows, maybe by understanding the potential pitfalls of a trade war, we can all work together to prevent one from happening in the first place.
That's a goal worth striving for.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, stay engaged, and keep learning.